This is Access 2019 Module 5 Part 15. In this segment we are looking at data validation rules. So we have two types of data validation rules that we will be discussing. First one are called field validation rules, and this is where we're only looking at one field in the table. The second type are called table validation rules, and they are looking at two fields, so they are comparing two fields within the table. The field validation rules, again, that's covering one field. It goes at the bottom of the screen in the field properties, and field names are not needed in these rules because you pick the field when you click on it at the top of the screen. Table validation rules are comparing two fields. They are going to be entered on the side of the screen in the table properties. And field names in these rules need to be in square brackets. So let's go ahead and get into our Access database. We're in the clinic database, and we're going to open up our billing table. We're going to go ahead and go to the design view for our table, and our field that we're going to be using for our field validation rule is the invoice amount. So remember, the rule is that you always have to click on the field in the top half of the screen before you begin putting information in the field properties in the bottom. So in the field properties, you're going to notice we have two options here. We have a validation rule, and then we have a validation text. The text is the data that, or the message that will appear if the rule is violated. So we're first going to click in the validation rule, and we're going to say that this invoice amount must be greater than 10. We do not need the invoice amount field name in the rule because we've already told it it's pertaining to the invoice amount field by putting it in the field properties that pertain to the invoice amount. Our text is going to read invoice amounts must be greater than 10. Make sure on your homework that you are very careful with your typing. You have to type match upper lower, spacing, punctuation. It all has to match exact in order to be counted correct. Now, the next thing I always want to do is I want to test the validation rule. So I'm going to switch to datasheet view. It's going to ask me to save. It is going to tell me that it's going to try to test this validation rule, and it may take a long time. This would only take a long time if there were a lot of records in our database. Because our tables are very small, because they're for samples and to illustrate points in class, this will never take a long time. So always say yes. It's going to test the data that's already in your table and make sure none of the records violate your rule. Let's test the rule. So the first thing we would do is we would try to put something in that's less than 10. So I'll say 6. And I should get an error, and I do. The validation rule will test immediately when you try to leave the field. Let's try to put actually 10. Because it's not greater than, we still get the message. Hit escape, and it will change the number back to what you had. So you do want to test your rule afterwards, and again, your validation rule field validation rule will test when you immediately try to leave the field. You're going to see in a few minutes that your table validation rules do not test at the same point. All right, let's go. Our next rule is going to compare the invoice amount and the insurance amount, because our insurance amount cannot be more than our invoice amount. And so that's a comparison between two fields, and it's going to be entered in a different spot. To enter our table validation rules where we compare two fields, we're going to click on this property sheet button that's up on our show hide group of the ribbon, and it's going to open the property sheet over here on the right hand side of our screen. You'll notice there we have a validation rule and a validation text. Same concept. We put the rule in, and then we put the text, which is the error message that will appear. All right, so we're going to say, fields go in square brackets, insurance. So once it appears, you can tab and it'll fill it in for you. Must be less than or equal to, and it's going to be the invoice amount. And so that is my rule. Insurance field must be less than or equal to the invoice amount. My text is going to read, insurance coverage cannot be larger than the invoice amount, period. Again, let's switch into the datasheet view to test it. It is going to ask us to save it, and it is going to tell us it's going to test the rule. So what we want to do is we want to test it. Now, it's hard to see the difference right now, and I'll move the field in a minute so you can see it. But it will not test until you try to leave the record. So if I said insurance was 150, I'm going to get the error message. I'm going to hit escape to change it back. All right, I'm going to go back into design view. And I'm going to move this insurance field up right next to the invoice amount. I'm going to save that change, and I'm going to switch. The reason I did that is I want you to see when it's going to test the change. Because I'm going along and I type in 150, and notice it does not give me the error message. It's not until I go to change into the next record. So until you go to leave the record, the table validation rules are not tested until you get ready to leave that record. So I'm going to hit escape to put the amount back, and we can see how that works. So I just want to go back and review field validation rules, one field, bottom of the screen, it tests when you leave the field. Table validation rules, two fields at the side of the screen, and it tests when you leave the record. Okay, so here we could say tests when leave field. And this one tests when leave record. And I'll wrap that. Okay, so again, you've got your field validation rules. One field, you're going to enter it at the bottom of the screen in the field properties. You do not need to put the field names in the rule, and it will test when it leaves the field. Table validation rules, 2 fields. You're going to enter them at the side of the screen in the table properties. You do need the field names in the rules, and they must be in the square brackets. It will test the rule when you leave the record, not when you leave the field. And that is your table validation rules.